The fall of a shepherd, the city had a way of wearing its scars in plain sight. Streets that once echoed with the laughter of children now carried only the low rumble of tired engines, the hiss of buses, and the shuffle of weary feet moving between flickering streetlights. The downtown core gleamed with freshly polished glass towers and high-rise apartments that had sprung up like weeds in just a few years. But only a mile further east, entire blocks still sagged beneath the weight of poverty and neglect. Cracked sidewalks wound past boarded-up storefronts, and the smell of fried food and exhaust clung to the evening air. It was in this pocket of forgotten America that Elijah Cross walked with his steady but slowing stride, his hands weighed down by grocery bags filled not for himself, but for those who had less. At 73, most men his age had retired into silence, content to rest in armchairs and watch the world drift past their window. Elijah was cut from a different cloth. Decades spent preaching the word had not dulled his sense of duty. If anything, his retirement from the pulpit had sharpened it, because now he had no sermons to prepare, no board meetings to attend, no schedule but the one he wrote himself. And so, almost every night when the city grew quiet and the streets emptied, he made his rounds to shelters and forgotten alleys, bearing food, blankets, or simply a kind word. It was not glamour, and it certainly was not safe, but it was what Elijah believed he had been placed on this earth to do. He paused in front of Walker's Corner Store, a fixture of the neighborhood that had survived multiple recessions, 2 attempted robberies, and the relentless march of chain supermarkets. Inside, the fluorescent lights hummed faintly, reflecting off the cracked tile floor. Maggie, the middle-aged cashier with a permanent smile etched into her round face, was already waiting behind the counter. She knew Elijah's routines by heart. "Another midnight run, Pastor Cross?" she asked, though technically he had not held that title in years. Elijah set his items carefully on the counter: soap, toothpaste, packs of hand warmers, and a stack of sandwiches wrapped in brown paper, and smiled. "Habit dies hard, Maggie. Besides, people are more likely to come out when it's dark. They think no one sees them. That's when they need someone the most." Maggie shook her head fondly, scanning the items. "This neighborhood isn't what it used to be. Too many strangers moving in, too many longtime folks being pushed out. You take care of yourself out there." Elijah chuckled, his weathered face creasing with lines that told stories of joy and sorrow in equal measure. "The Lord's walked with me this long. I figure he won't stop tonight." He paid in exact change from his worn wallet, then hefted the bags again, nodding to Maggie before stepping back into the cool embrace of the night. The walk was familiar, but tonight it carried a tension he couldn't quite name. Maybe it was the quiet, the kind of quiet that doesn't mean peace, but rather a breath being held. The glow of street lamps stretched shadows long and sharp across the broken concrete, and the faint rustle of movement in alleys felt heavier than usual. Elijah carried on, his steps even, the plastic bag swaying against his legs. As he turned onto Maple Avenue, the sound of raised voices drifted through the narrow passage between 2 brick buildings. At first he thought it might be another argument between teenagers, but as he drew closer, the tone sharpened. Fear, desperation. Elijah's heart tightened as he caught sight of the scene. A boy, no older than 16, cornered against the wall by 2 men in plain clothes. The boy's hoodie hung loose on his thin frame, and his hands trembled as he held them up in surrender. "I swear I don't have anything," the boy stammered. "Please just let me go home." One of the men, broad-shouldered with a mean set to his jaw, leaned closer, his badge flashing too quickly to be studied. "Nobody runs unless they've got something to hide." "You think we're stupid?" The other, shorter with a shaved head, smirked, stepping closer to block the boy's only exit. Elijah's instinct warred with caution. At his age, he was no match for 2 men in their prime, but silence was complicity, and if he had learned anything in his decades of ministry, it was that you did not walk away when someone was in need. He set his bags down gently by the nearest lamppost, squared his shoulders, and stepped forward into the light. "Evening, gentlemen," he called, his voice steady, though not confrontational. "Everything all right here?" Both men turned sharply, their faces hardening at the sight of the elderly figure approaching. "Police business?" the tall one snapped, holding his badge up again. "Move along." Elijah did not stop. His hands remained open at his sides, his posture calm. "He seems frightened," he said evenly, nodding toward the boy. "Perhaps I can help." My name is Elijah Cross. I run the community center on Washington. Maybe I can mediate whatever's happening here. The teenager's wide eyes darted to him with a flash of desperate hope, but before he could speak, the shorter officer barked. This doesn't concern you, old man. Back off. Elijah slowed but did not yield. If he's suspected of something, perhaps you could tell me what. And if he's not under arrest, then maybe... The taller man stepped in, cutting him off. Last warning. You're interfering. Leave now. Elijah met the boy's gaze, then whispered one word that only the teenager could hear. Run. The boy bolted, legs pumping down the street. His fear granting him speed the two officers couldn't immediately match. Fury flared in their eyes, and both turned their full attention to Elijah. You just helped a suspect escape, the tall one growled. He's a child, Elijah replied calmly. He was scared. He didn't have time to finish the sentence before a hard shove sent him stumbling backward. Pain shot through his chest as he tried to regain his balance, but the second officer grabbed his arm and twisted it cruelly behind his back. You're under arrest for obstruction, he spat, forcing Elijah to his knees. Please, there's no need for... The first punch cut him short, landing in his ribs with sickening precision. White-hot pain exploded in his side as his body folded under the impact. Shut up. You should have walked away. The blows came fast after that. Calculated strikes meant to leave him broken but not immediately dead. He tried to shield himself, but his 73-year-old frame offered little defense against trained brutality. His glasses shattered against the pavement. His breath came ragged as another kick cracked his ribs, and the taste of blood filled his mouth. Somewhere in the haze of agony, Elijah noticed a flicker of movement at the edge of the alley. A homeless man, barely more than a shadow himself, stood watching with a phone raised shakily in his hands. Their eyes met for a fleeting second, Elijah's swollen, bloodied face silently begging him to keep recording. That small act gave him a shred of hope even as darkness closed in around him. Enough, the tall officer finally muttered, wiping sweat from his brow. Get him out of sight. They dragged Elijah deeper into the alley and dumped him like discarded trash behind a dumpster, his breaths shallow and uneven. The last thing he heard before losing consciousness entirely was one of them sneering, "Nobody's going to miss another old man." Morning arrived with the cold sterility of hospital lights. Machines beeped in steady rhythm beside Elijah's broken body, tubes and bandages doing the work his battered lungs and fractured ribs could not. His face was swollen nearly beyond recognition, one eye sealed shut, and bruises painted his skin in cruel shades of purple. In the waiting room, the local news played on a mounted television, its anchor reading with professional neutrality. An elderly man was hospitalized last night after what authorities describe as a confrontation with police officers in the Gibson neighborhood. Video footage shows the man resisting arrest after interfering in an officer's duties. The grainy cell phone clip that aired began only after Elijah had already been forced to the ground, showing what appeared to be officers struggling with an aggressive suspect. Context stripped away, truth buried under narrative. The officers involved have been placed on administrative leave pending investigation, the anchor continued, before moving on to weather updates as if nothing monumental had occurred. Hundreds of miles away, nestled in a remote cabin surrounded by pine and silence, a man sat cleaning a hunting rifle with the kind of meticulous precision that came from years of repetition. Cameron Cross was 35 years old, his body lean and muscled, his expression carved from stone. 8 years had passed since he had left the world behind, trading the chaos of war zones for the stillness of wilderness. He had not answered his phone in months, not returned a letter in years. His only company was the occasional deer that wandered close enough to observe him curiously, before bounding back into the forest. The solitude had been deliberate. After everything he had done and seen as a special operations soldier, he wanted no part of the world that had broken him. Yet when the phone buzzed again on the table beside him, something in him stirred. He let it go to voicemail, but curiosity, or perhaps instinct, pushed him to press play. A voice deep and urgent filled the quiet cabin. "My name is Thomas Washington. You don't know me, but I know your father. He's in Riverside Hospital. They almost killed him. Room 3007, he might not make it." The rifle cleaning cloth slipped from Cameron's hand as his grip tightened around the phone. For a long moment he stared at the wall motionless. Then, with a deep breath that sounded almost like a growl, he crossed the room to a trunk he had not opened in nearly a decade. Inside lay a stack of unopened letters, all addressed in his father's careful handwriting. Beneath them a single photograph, Elijah with his arm around a teenage Cameron, both smiling as if the world held no shadows. Cameron picked it up, his stoic mask cracking just enough to reveal the ghost of a memory. He did not open the letters, not yet. Instead, he reached for his duffel bag. The wilderness had been his refuge, but blood ties ran deeper than silence. The world he had abandoned was calling him back, and this time, it would not let him go quietly. The return of the soldier. The drive back to the city felt like moving between two worlds. For 8 years, Cameron Cross had measured life in the rhythm of pine trees swaying in the wind, in the sharp crack of a twig underfoot during a hunt, in the stillness of nights broken only by the hoot of owls or the howl of coyotes. He had built walls of silence around himself, convincing his mind and heart that the world he had once bled for no longer had any claim on him. But as the highway narrowed and the skyline began to rise in the distance, those walls started to crumble. He caught glimpses of neighborhoods sliding past his windshield, some revitalized with gleaming coffee shops and dog parks, others decaying in neglect. He knew this duality well. It was the same divide his father had spent his life bridging, feeding the hungry on one corner while developers plotted on the next. Cameron drove with his jaw set, one hand gripping the steering wheel tightly enough for his knuckles to whiten. The closer he came to Riverside Hospital, the heavier his chest grew, as though the weight of every unanswered call, every unopened letter, and every bitter silence had taken form and settled in his lungs. The hospital itself loomed like a fortress of glass and concrete, its sterile design at odds with the warmth of the man who lay inside. Cameron parked in a nondescript spot at the edge of the lot and sat for a moment, staring at the sliding doors. His reflection stared back at him from the windshield. Hard eyes, lines etched prematurely into a face once youthful. A man who looked older than his years because war and exile had demanded their tax. He stepped out with purposeful precision, jeans and a plain gray t-shirt doing nothing to hide the military bearing in his stride. People turned to look at him without quite knowing why. They recognized something in the posture, the way he scanned exits automatically, the way his presence seemed to claim space without asking permission. Inside, the antiseptic smell of disinfectant clashed with the faint scent of burnt coffee from the lobby cafe. Nurses hurried past with clipboards, and the muted hum of machines floated down the corridor. As Cameron approached the reception desk, an older woman watering the plants near the wall gasped softly, the metal can slipping from her hands and splashing water at her feet. Her eyes widened as if she were seeing a ghost. "Lord have mercy," she whispered, her voice trembling. Cameron Cross. He froze, his gaze flicking to her in quiet acknowledgement. She stepped closer, lowering her voice. "We didn't think you'd ever come back. Not after what happened with your mother." The words hit like shrapnel, and though Cameron's face remained unreadable, his jaw tightened. He gave a single nod and spoke the only words necessary. "Room 307. The woman simply pointed, her expression caught between awe and sorrow. The walk down the corridor was a gauntlet of memory. Each step pulled Cameron further into the past he had buried, the echo of his father's sermons, the laughter of children at the community center, the sound of his mother's voice before illness had stolen it forever. At the doorway, he hesitated for the briefest moment before stepping inside. The sight waiting for him threatened to break even the iron shell he had built around himself. His father lay beneath a forest of tubes and monitors, his face swollen and bruised, lips cracked, skin pale against the stark white sheets. The steady beep of the heart monitor was the only sign that life had not yet abandoned him. Cameron's hands clenched into fists at his sides before he forced himself forward, sitting rigidly in the chair beside the bed. For several minutes he did not speak. He only stared at the rise and fall of his father's chest, his own breathing shallow as though matching it unconsciously. Finally, his voice, gravelly from years of disuse, broke the silence. "I never got to say I was sorry." The words hung heavy in the air until another voice answered from the doorway, soft but clear. "He wouldn't want your sorry. He just wants you here." Cameron turned sharply. A young nurse stood with her hands folded, dark hair pulled into a bun, her name tag catching the fluorescent light. Amira Santos. She stepped inside, closing the door gently behind her. "I've been caring for him since he was brought in. Your father isn't just a patient here. He's the man who taught my brother how to read at the community center, the one who brought food when my mother lost her job." He's loved more than you may realize. She hesitated, her eyes searching his. But the official story is wrong. They're saying he resisted arrest, that he interfered and became aggressive. But that's not what happened. Cameron's gaze sharpened, his silence commanding her to continue. Amira reached into her pocket and produced a small USB drive. My cousin has a spot across from the liquor store on Maple. He records everything just in case. He caught most of what happened that night. She placed the drive into Cameron's hand, her fingers brushing his for the briefest moment. Your father was protecting a boy. That's who he is. Still trying to save others even when it costs him. He's a hero even if no one else wants to see it. Cameron closed his fingers around the drive, feeling its weight as though it were a weapon. He gave her a short nod, the closest thing to gratitude his voice could manage. That night, Cameron left the hospital and walked the streets of his childhood neighborhood. Rain misted down, slicking the sidewalks and painting the glow of street lamps in shimmering halos. He moved slowly, memorizing every change. The corner stores had been replaced with boutique cafes and art galleries. Old brick apartment buildings were either demolished or scaffolded for renovation. Luxury signs promised urban renewal. But Cameron knew what that really meant. Displacement, erasure, the slow suffocation of the community his father had fought to protect. Yet in pockets, the old neighborhood still clung to life. Graffiti-tagged walls, kids playing basketball under a flickering light. Elders gathered on porches whispering about the old days. Cameron felt both like an intruder and a son returning to a home that no longer existed. He stopped in front of the community center his father had built. The once bright mural painted on the side wall was faded now, chipped by time, but it still showed Elijah's vision, hands of all colors clasped together beneath the words "Strength in Unity." Cameron traced the letters with his eyes, his chest tightening. He heard footsteps behind him and turned sharply, hand instinctively half reaching for a weapon he no longer carried. A man approached, clean-cut but with faded tattoos crawling up his neck, his posture a blend of confidence and caution. "Well, I'll be damned," the man said, a wry smile tugging at his lips. "The prodigal son returns." Cameron narrowed his gaze before recognition set in. "Aaron?" The man's grin widened, though it never reached his eyes. "Didn't think you'd remember me." "It's been a minute. You look different." Aaron Tate had once been a lost soul, spiraling deep into gangs and addiction before Elijah had pulled him back from the edge. Elijah had helped him into rehab, fought for his custody rights when his daughter was taken, and refused to let him drown in the same streets that had swallowed so many others. Now Aaron stood in front of Cameron, clean but hardened by years of survival. "The old man saved me," Aaron said quietly. "Got me a job, kept me steady. I owe him everything. And now look what they've done to him." His voice thickened with anger, then softened with something else. "You disappeared, man. No letters, no calls. People thought you were dead." Cameron said nothing, only stared with the same unreadable intensity that had carried him through combat zones. Aaron sighed, running a hand over his face. "Things ain't the same around here. Cops don't serve, they control. Developers are buying up blocks and using those same cops to clear people out. Your father was one of the last standing in their way. And now?" His voice trailed off. Cameron's silence stretched, but Aaron saw something flicker in his eyes, a glint of resolve, the spark of a soldier waking from hibernation. "What are you gonna do?" Aaron asked finally. Cameron's voice was low, measured, but it carried the weight of a promise. "Find out who put him in that bed." Shadows of power. The neighborhood looked the same, but to Cameron, every corner was charged with memory and threat. The streets he had once raced down as a boy, basketball in hand, now seemed narrower, the shadows heavier, as if the city itself was holding its breath. He had always known this place was layered, one face for the public, another for those who actually lived here, and still another hidden beneath deals whispered in backrooms and alleyways. His father had always fought against that hidden face, believing that light would always expose darkness. But as Cameron walked deeper into the heart of the city, he realized the darkness had adapted, learned to wear suits and carry briefcases by day, and badges and batons by night. The new apartment towers rising like jagged teeth in the skyline weren't just signs of progress. They were monuments to a silent war being waged against the very people who had built these blocks with sweat and sacrifice. It didn't take Cameron long to notice the patterns. Buildings with the highest community presence, the churches, the shelters, The small businesses that had fed generations were either mysteriously closing, condemned for safety concerns, or bought out at insultingly low prices. Those who resisted seemed to find themselves harassed, ticketed, or in some cases, quietly gone. Cameron's instincts sharpened with each observation. This wasn't just coincidence. It was a campaign, calculated and deliberate, one his father had clearly been standing in the middle of. He thought of Elijah's battered body lying in that hospital bed, and the anger that had been simmering since the phone call hardened into steel. His father had not been attacked simply for defending a boy. He had been silenced because he represented resistance, a reminder that this neighborhood was not for sale. Aaron became his first guide back into the undercurrent of the city. They met the next evening in a dingy diner whose neon sign buzzed weakly against the night. The booths were cracked vinyl, the smell of grease hung heavy in the air, and the waitress didn't bother to hide her weariness as she poured lukewarm coffee into chipped mugs. Aaron leaned across the table, his voice low. "You're right to be suspicious. This thing goes deeper than just a couple of dirty cops roughing up an old man. They're part of something bigger." He glanced around before continuing. "There's a detective, Marcus Hale. He's been with the department for years, and he's got his hands in every deal that moves through here. Development contracts, gang truces, even the school board. He makes sure nothing happens in this neighborhood without his approval. And anyone who stands in his way disappears one way or another." Aaron's expression hardened. Your father was too visible, too respected. They couldn't buy him, so they broke him. Cameron listened in silence, every detail etching itself into his mind like a battle plan. He asked questions sparingly, each one precise. Where did Hale operate? Who were his enforcers? What businesses acted as fronts? Aaron provided what he could, though it was clear even speaking the man's name carried risk. He's got cops, developers, even politicians in his pocket, Aaron warned. You go after him. You're not just fighting a man, you're fighting a machine. Cameron's reply was calm, almost too calm. Machines break. That night, Cameron began his own quiet reconnaissance. He walked the streets not as the son returning home, but as the soldier who had spent years mastering the art of moving unseen. He noticed the unmarked cars idling on corners longer than they should, the men who carried themselves like police even out of uniform, the way conversations on stoops cut off abruptly when certain figures passed by. He followed one of the plainclothes officers who had been at the alley that night, shadowing him for blocks until he entered a bar pulsing with low music and guarded by men whose eyes were colder than their drinks. Cameron didn't go in, not yet. He only memorized faces, routes, times. Information was ammunition, and he was stockpiling. Days blurred into nights as Cameron pieced the puzzle together. He set up in a small rented room above a laundromat, the kind of place no one asked questions. Maps and notes soon covered the walls, arrows connecting names, photographs pinned beside addresses, the USB drive's grainy footage playing again and again on a battered laptop. Each viewing ignited the same fire in his chest, the same fury at the sight of his father's body being broken under fists meant to protect. The more he watched, the more he saw. The calculated nature of the attack, the deliberate malice, the arrogance of men who believed there would be no consequences. Amira visited the hospital room daily, updating Cameron quietly whenever their paths crossed. Elijah remained unconscious, his condition stable but fragile. Each time Cameron sat at his father's bedside, he felt a strange pull between past and present. He remembered the man who had once stood taller than anyone in his young eyes, whose voice could command a room not through volume, but through conviction, who had carried both Bible and burden with equal strength. Now that man lay silent, his body reduced to fragility, his spirit muted by violence. Cameron leaned close one evening, his words low enough that only the machines could hear. I'm here, old man. I don't know if you can hear me, but I'm not running anymore. They think they put you down. They're wrong. I'm going to make sure they never do this again. To anyone. The first clash came sooner than expected. Cameron had been trailing a pair of Hale's men, officers in uniform this time, though their behavior made it clear they served more than just the badge. They entered a closed storefront late at night, and Cameron slipped into an alley across the street, watching through a cracked window. Inside, developers in suits pored over documents while the officers stood guard. Property deeds changed hands, envelopes thick with cash slid across the table. It was everything Aaron had warned him about. Corruption laid bare in real time. Cameron raised his phone to record, but a shadow fell across him before he could capture more than a minute. "Lose something, soldier?" The voice was mocking, familiar. Cameron turned, recognizing the tall officer who had shoved his father into the pavement. For a moment, the alley seemed to contract, narrowing until it was just the two of them. The officer smirked, his hand hovering near the weapon on his belt. "Thought I recognized you lurking around. You look like him. Guess you came to play hero, too." Behind him, another figure emerged, the shorter cop with the shaved head, his grin sharp as a blade. "2 for 1 tonight," he said. Cameron's body moved before his mind did. Instincts honed from years of combat igniting in an instant. The first officer reached for his baton, but Cameron struck first. A precise blow to the wrist that sent it clattering to the ground. The second lunged, but Cameron sidestepped, his elbow driving into the man's ribs with brutal efficiency. The alley exploded into a flurry of motion, fists and grunts echoing off brick walls. These men were trained, but they were brawlers compared to him. Cameron's movements were fluid, controlled, each strike designed to disable, not waste energy. Within moments, both men were on the ground groaning, their arrogance replaced with shock. Cameron crouched over the tall one, his voice low and lethal. "Tell Hale I'm coming, and this time he won't see me coming." He left them broken but alive, their weapons scattered in the dirt. As he walked away, heart pounding but mind sharp, he realized something had shifted. He was no longer just investigating, no longer simply a son seeking truth. He had declared war, and the shadows of power would soon learn that the soldier they thought long buried had returned, and he had nothing left to lose. Fire on the streets by the next morning. The entire neighborhood buzzed with whispers. Nobody had seen the fight in the alley, but everybody somehow knew. Word in these streets traveled faster than sirens, carried on hushed conversations at bus stops, in barbershops, in laundromats where women folded clothes with one eye on the door. They said the 2 officers were found bruised, bloodied, their pride stripped as raw as their skin. They said both men claimed they'd been ambushed, though no one believed it. Because the story that carried most fiercely wasn't of 2 cops beaten in the night, but of someone who had finally struck back. A ghost had returned, a soldier out of time, and people whispered his name as if it were an omen. Cameron Cross. For the first time in years, fear didn't just belong to the residents. It lingered in the eyes of the enforcers who once thought themselves untouchable. Cameron knew he'd crossed a line, and he also knew there was no going back. That alley had been more than a skirmish. It was a declaration, one he hadn't just made to Hale and his men, but to himself. The soldier inside him was no longer dormant. He spent the day moving like a shadow, blending into places he once knew, testing how the city responded. He saw more patrols than usual, pairs of uniforms moving not to protect but to intimidate, their eyes searching faces more sharply than before. Developers' black cars lingered on curbs with tinted windows rolled just low enough to watch. Even the old heads on the porches sat quieter, their gazes carrying a warning. They're hunting for you. But for all their searching, Cameron understood the streets better than they understood him. He'd spent years learning how to vanish in war zones, how to make himself invisible in landscapes hostile to his very breath. Compared to the deserts and jungles he'd walked through with death at his shoulder, this city was an old map, familiar even beneath its new skin. He moved along alleys, through abandoned buildings, across rooftops slick with last night's rain, every step reminding him of who he had become. Yet there was more than survival driving him now. There was purpose, the kind his father had always carried. It wasn't enough to wound the machine, he had to dismantle it piece by piece. Aaron came to him again, this time more nervous than before. They met inside the shell of an old community center gym, where dust clung to the air like cobwebs and broken basketball hoops dangled from bent rims. "They're looking for you, Cam," Aaron said, his voice low but urgent. "Not just the cops, Hale himself. He's furious, and that makes him dangerous. Word is he's pulling in muscle, not just uniforms. He's hiring from the same gangs your father used to keep at bay. Old alliances are breaking, and they'll burn the block down if it means flushing you out." Aaron's eyes were sharp with something beyond fear, respect mixed with dread. "You lit a fire, man. People are watching. Some are scared, but others are ready to believe again. They see you as the spark your father always was." Cameron didn't answer right away. He stood near the broken window, looking out at the street below. Children darted between cars, their laughter rising above the grind of traffic, oblivious to the storm building around them. For them, this was just another day. For Cameron, it was proof of what was at stake. He turned back to Aaron, his voice quiet but unyielding. This isn't about belief. This is about survival. If Hale's pulling gangs into his pocket, then we don't just have corruption to deal with. We have a war brewing. And if war is what's coming, then I won't let our people be caught defenseless. That night, the streets lit up in violence, not from Cameron's hand, but from Hale's retaliation. Police raided the corner stores that refused to sell, slamming owners to the ground while claiming violations no one could prove. Men in hoodies and colors, gang affiliates with new paymasters, spray-painted threats across the walls of Elijah Cross's community center, scrawling words meant to bleed hope out of brick. A firebomb shattered the front window of a family-owned restaurant that had once hosted every neighborhood meeting Elijah had led. Smoke bled into the night, and though the fire was quickly contained, the message wasn't subtle. Resistance would be punished. The city's silence only made it louder. Cameron watched from the shadows as chaos unfolded, his fists clenched so tightly the scars on his knuckles stretched white. Every instinct screamed at him to strike, to break those who dared to desecrate his father's work, but he forced himself still. A soldier knew when to attack, but more importantly, when not to. Recklessness would only feed Hale's narrative of a dangerous vigilante stalking the streets. Instead, Cameron memorized every face, every action, burning them into his mind as names to be answered for. His revenge wasn't about rage, it was about precision. He would make them pay, but he would do it in a way that exposed the rot Hale had buried under layers of power. Amira's voice echoed in his memory as he returned to the hospital later that night, slipping quietly into his father's room. She was there already, adjusting the IV line, her eyes lifting to meet his as if she had expected him. For a moment, the world's weight lifted just slightly. She didn't scold him, didn't ask where he'd been, but she could read the storm in his posture. "It's starting, isn't it?" she whispered. Cameron looked at his father, his chest rising and falling beneath the tubes, and answered without looking at her. "No, it's already here." He sat at his father's bedside, speaking words Elijah might never hear but that Cameron needed to say. "You built this place with your hands, with your heart. You gave them something to fight for even when it cost you everything. I used to think walking away was strength, that burying the past meant surviving. But I was wrong. Strength is standing in the fire and refusing to move. You taught me that even when I didn't want to hear it. I'm going to fight, Father. Not just for you, but for everyone they've tried to break. They wanted to silence you. Instead, they woke me." By the time Cameron left the hospital, the city's silence had shifted. Sirens no longer sounded like authority. They sounded like war drums. The glow of construction towers in the distance looked less like progress, and more like watchtowers of an occupying force. The people moved more cautiously, glancing over shoulders, lowering voices. And yet somewhere beneath the fear, Cameron could feel it. A current stirring, a quiet defiance rising in the hearts of those who had been beaten down for too long. Hale had power, but Cameron had something Hale had never understood. Legacy, belief, and the kind of rage that only came from love. The soldier had returned. The fire had begun, and the streets of the city were about to learn that ghosts don't just haunt, they fight. Legacy of fire, the city didn't sleep that week, though most pretended it did. Behind closed doors, families whispered about the escalation. The raids, the fires, the sudden surge of uniforms prowling blocks that never saw patrols unless there was profit to be made. Shops that had refused to sell their property sat dark and boarded, their owners driven into silence by fear or forced into debt overnight. But silence was not the same as surrender. Beneath the surface, the neighborhood simmered with an energy that had not been felt in decades. Old men who once marched during civil rights protests, mothers who had seen too many sons buried too soon, young people who refused to leave their homes even when lured with false promises of relocation. They all began to look toward one figure, moving through their streets like an echo from the past. Cameron Cross. Some had only known his father. Others remembered Cameron as a restless boy who vanished into the army. Now they saw something different in his presence, the raw, unflinching embodiment of defiance. Hale, for his part, could no longer dismiss him as rumor. Cameron's name had become a curse in the precinct, whispered in hallways where officers drank bitter coffee and pretended not to be afraid. 2 men had already been hospitalized. Others spoke of being followed at night, Their own tactics turned against them. Hale had built his empire on intimidation, but he was beginning to taste it himself. His contacts in City Hall were demanding results, warning him that investors were growing nervous. Developers didn't like headlines about corruption or grainy videos of beatings shared online. For the first time in years, Hale felt pressure from above as well as below. That made him reckless. He ordered sweeps, sanctioned off-the-record assaults, pushed his men to bring Cameron in at any cost. But catching a ghost was never easy, and each failed attempt only made Cameron's legend grow larger. Cameron knew Hale would overreach. That was his plan all along. He'd been patient, gathering pieces, letting Hale show his hand. The USB Amira had given him had been just the start. With Aaron's help, Cameron traced the web of shell companies laundering money into Hale's hands. He mapped out the corridors of power, identifying which politicians owed favors, which businesses were fronts, which gang leaders had been bought, and which ones were only pretending loyalty out of fear. Piece by piece, the puzzle revealed itself. A blueprint of corruption stretching from the alleys of his father's neighborhood to the glass towers downtown. And Cameron realized something that steeled his resolve. This wasn't just about saving Elijah's block. It was about breaking a machine that had been grinding people down for decades. The night it all came to a head, the city held its breath. Hale's men set a trap, flooding Maple Avenue with squad cars, their lights painting the buildings in sickly flashes of red and blue. A line of officers in riot gear advanced, shields gleaming, batons raised. Behind them, Hale stood in the shadow of a black SUV, flanked by hired muscle from gangs eager to prove their loyalty. They expected Cameron to come alone, to strike recklessly as he had in the alley. Instead, the streets filled with people. Not armed soldiers, not fighters trained in war, but neighbors. Men, women, and teenagers who had grown tired of being prey. They carried no weapons, only their voices, their phones, their sheer refusal to disappear quietly. From windows above, cameras pointed down, live streams already climbing across social media feeds. Hale wanted a crackdown in silence. What he got was a stage. Cameron stepped forward from the crowd, his presence cutting through the night like a blade. He wore no mask, no armor, just a plain jacket and the unshakable steadiness of someone who had already made peace with whatever end awaited him. His voice carried across the tense standoff. "This is where it ends, Hale. No more raids. No more lies. You don't get to decide who belongs here. You don't get to decide who lives and who bleeds for your profit." The crowd murmured, their courage building at the sound of defiance given flesh. Hale sneered, signaling his men to advance, but the people didn't scatter. Instead, they pressed closer together, shoulder to shoulder, their phones raised high. Every baton raised would be seen, every blow recorded, every injustice immortalized. The first officer hesitated, then another. The line faltered as doubt spread. These weren't faceless criminals in an alley. These were their own neighbors, grandparents, children. Hale shouted orders, fury boiling in his voice, but the spell of fear he had relied on for years was cracking. And then Cameron moved, not with violence, but with precision. He pulled from his jacket the evidence he had gathered. Documents, recordings, the video of his father's beating in full. Not the clipped version the department had released. Screens lit up across the crowd as Aaron and others broadcast the files live. The truth spilled into the world in real time, undeniable, unedited. Hale's empire unraveled in seconds, his voice drowned out by the roar of outrage swelling through the streets. Yet Hale was not a man to accept defeat quietly. In a final act of desperation, he drew his weapon, aiming it straight at Cameron. For an instant, time froze. The crowd gasped, cameras zoomed, and the weight of every moment led to this. But Cameron did not flinch. He stood tall, his gaze locked on Hale, his voice steady as iron. "You can pull that trigger, but it won't save you. All it will do is prove everything we already know. That you were never here to protect, only to control. And I am not afraid of you." Perhaps it was the cameras. Perhaps it was the sudden awareness that history itself was watching, but Hale's hand shook. Before he could decide, officers behind him moved. Not toward Cameron, but toward their own commander. Hands grabbed his arm, forcing the gun down. One by one, men who had once obeyed him without question turned away, unwilling to bear the weight of his downfall. Hale's roar of rage echoed uselessly as he was dragged back, his empire collapsing not in gunfire but in abandonment. Cameron didn't smile. Victory wasn't joy. It was relief, it was exhaustion. It was the heavy knowledge that the war was never truly over, only shifted into new forms. He turned back to the crowd, raising his voice once more. This doesn't end with me. This ends with all of us standing together, refusing to bow. My father believed in that, even when it nearly cost him his life. If you want this neighborhood to survive, if you want your children to know it as home, then you have to carry that belief forward. No soldier can win a war alone, but a people united cannot be broken. Days later, Elijah Cross passed quietly in his sleep, his body too battered to recover, but his spirit undefeated. The funeral drew hundreds, spilling out onto the streets, a sea of faces lifted not in despair but in determination. Cameron stood at the front, the folded flag of his service tucked beneath one arm, his other hand resting on his father's coffin. He spoke only once, his voice raw but unwavering. You taught me that strength is not in what we take, but in what we give. You gave everything. Now it's our turn. The months that followed were not easy. Hale's downfall exposed rot that ran deeper than anyone had guessed. Trials dragged on, appeals were filed. New names emerged from the shadows. But for the first time in years, the neighborhood was not waiting for a savior. It was building itself again. The community center reopened, its walls repaired by the very hands Elijah had once guided. Aaron organized youth programs. Amira expanded the literacy classes Elijah had started. And Cameron, though he never sought the spotlight, became a quiet guardian, always present, always watching. A soldier no longer running from his past but carrying it forward.